Domestic violence is a leading cause of homelessness for women and children. We discuss domestic violence impact and resources, and we discuss free legal services available locally. It's all here on the next Latino Motion. Join us.
Choose to get lost in the woods to gain experience in forest management.
Choose to travel through time to understand the past.
Choose to soar to pursue a career in dance.
Stockton University offers 50 high-quality academic programs, small class sizes, and affordable tuition. Choose to match your interests and talents at one of New Jersey's nationally ranked universities.
Latino Motion with Bert Lopez is presented by Latino Motion Public Affairs Media, a New Jersey nonprofit corporation, and Stockton University. This edition of Latino Motion with Bert Lopez is brought to you by the HD Studios at the campus of Stockton University. Funding for Latino Motion is provided by Atlanticare, healthcare you can believe in. Atlantic City Electric, energy for a changing world. And South Jersey Gas. Welcome to Latino Motion, a weekly interview show highlighting issues impacting New Jersey's Latino community while advancing understanding of Latino cultural heritage and contributions to our society. And here is your host, Bert Lopez.
Buenos dias and welcome to Latino Motion. Domestic violence is a leading cause of homelessness for women and children. Joining me to discuss the impact of domestic violence and available resources are Bernadette Lamp and Danielle Brown with the Camden County Women's Center. Ladies, welcome to Latino Motion.
Thank you for having us.
So we see one impact of domestic violence is certainly the fact that it's a leading cause of homelessness for women and children. There are a lot of other impacts of domestic violence. And Bernadette, tell me a little bit about some of those impacts.
The impacts are pretty broad. Generally, when people think of domestic violence, they tend to think only of physical violence. So they think in terms of black eyes or bruises or broken bones and those medical issues. What they fail to generally think of are the more insidious things that happen: financial abuse, emotional abuse, psychological abuse, sexual abuse. Those are the things that also impact. So if someone's experiencing financial abuse, homelessness is a result, bad credit is a result, damaged ability to move on, to get transportation, and that impacts, has a trickle-down effect to pretty much every aspect of somebody's life.
So it's not just the physical, obviously, and we know that when people come in for help, when their victim comes in for help, often not, it is the physical abuse, and sometimes they ignore some of these other signs, if you will, of domestic violence. And I know you respond to victims of domestic violence. Do you see most of the time is physical abuse?
Most of the time, I would say the majority of the time is physical abuse, but it could also be financial abuse. I do see victims that are being, basically their whole life is controlled by their husband or their abuser. They don't have control over their money, or they got to pass over their check every week when they get paid. They have to show receipts. So a lot of financial abuse we see, and a lot of emotional abuse, being talked to a certain way, like being talked down to all the time. And maybe that might be going on for years and never been hit or physically abused, but the emotional abuse is just tearing into the victim.
Let's talk about some more of those, if you will, warning signs of domestic violence, because often a victim may not know that they're in a domestic until later on, when it gets more volatile, it gets more dangerous. Bernadette, tell me about some of those signs.
I think it's important to understand that domestic violence is about control. Okay. And it's one person attempting to control another person. And they do that with various tactics. And that's where, when we're talking about the emotional abuse, the financial abuse, those are all tactics that somebody uses to control someone else. And when it gets to the physical, that's also a tool to control somebody. So when we speak of domestic violence, that's what we're speaking, control.
What qualifies as a healthy relationship? I guess a lot of people ask that, what's the difference between a domestic violence, and it's probably very obvious to most folks, but what really constitutes a healthy relationship?
I would say equal. That's what we talk about a lot. Are you equal? Do you make the same? Do you talk about the decisions together, or is someone making the decision and ending conversations? Are you guys having? Are you comfortable in your relationship where you can say, I want to go buy a car, or I feel okay with going away for the weekend, and without fearing that your abuser or your partner is going to, come back at you and talk to you and say, or maybe even threaten you and say, if you do that, I'm gonna retaliation. If you do that, then I'm gonna do this. Like that's not being equal. It's not a fair relationship. So you have to look at all different things when you're in a relationship. That's what I think.
And power. Are there even grounds of power? Mm-hmm. And is one person trying to coerce another person into various behaviors with which they wouldn't normally be comfortable?
And isolation is also part of that, isn't it? Because often we see victims that are isolated from their family members, that the abuser just doesn't want to have contact with the family members and others.
We consider that step one.
Yeah.
Step one.
Mm-hmm. It's a huge factor.
So why, and this is an important question because everyone asks this, why do people stay in abusive relationships?
I can see there's lots of reasons. A main reason I would think, one main reason I think is it could be a threat. There could be a threat. If you leave me, I'm going to kill you and the kids. Or if you leave me, I'm going to kill someone that you love. And there could be the financial part where that person has no money and they've been a housewife for the past 20 years. And if they leave and pick up and go to a safe house, what a big difference it is to go from your nice suburban home into a safe house where you have to have communal living with a lot of other victims and other children, and then you don't have a car and you don't have funds. So some victims would decide to stay because they would have to give up. Their kids have karate and their kids have soccer and their kids have they have a routine every day. So sometimes to them it's worth sacrificing. Mm-hmm. To stay in that relationship so they don't change the norm for the children and for themselves.
Well, one of the important things we want to discuss is what services are out there. So if someone is in a domestic violence situation, they're a victim, how can they get help? We want to discuss that, but we're going to take a quick break. We'll be right back with more Latino Motion.
Latino Motion with Bert Lopez is presented by Latino Motion Public Affairs Media, a New Jersey nonprofit corporation. Join us online at www.latinomotion.tv. Find us on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. We encourage your comments and contributions for show topics.
Welcome back to Latino Motion. We'll continue our discussion with the resources available for victims of domestic violence with the representatives from the Camden County Women's Center. Bernadette, Danielle, again, we were talking about what is domestic violence, and we want to talk more about the resources. So obviously, the Camden County Women's Center provides a lot of resources for women who may be in trouble. Tell me a little bit about the resources you offer.
Camden County Women's Center is the lead domestic violence agency in Camden County. Every county in the state has a lead agency. For Camden, it's us. For Gloucester and I believe Cumberland, it's an organization called SERVE, Services Empowering Rights of Victims. And I believe that Salem County is the Salem County Women's Center. There's also a national domestic violence hotline. So anyone who is experiencing domestic violence, they can reach out to their county organization or the national organization.
So is that the first line of defense, so to speak, is to make the call?
That's the absolute first line of defense. Make that phone call, get in touch with somebody, and we will do our best to put you in touch with what resources are appropriate for you.
So I know that a lot of my audience knows folks who only speak Spanish. I understand that your agency also have bilingual case managers that are able to help as well.
We have bilingual case managers. We have a children's program, PALS, Peace and Learn Solution, for children who have witnessed domestic violence in their homes. And those case managers and those program supervisors are bilingual. Our receptionist, Migdalia, is bilingual. We have bilingual case managers. Our hotline has bilingual people. I think it's important too to mention, this it just occurred to me, anyone with immigration status, we're not concerned about your immigration status. If you're a victim of domestic violence, you're welcome. We do not discriminate based on your income, your status, what you may or may not have.
That's a very good point, because that's often a limiting factor for getting help. It's just there is a lot of cases where the abuser is going to say they're going to report the individual, and they're fearful of being separated from their children and so forth.
Yes.
So that's very important. Let's talk about the domestic response team. What is it and what does it do?
It's DVRT, Domestic Violence Response Team. So we have, across Camden County, we have over 100 volunteers that are 40-hour trained by us. So we go, Bernadette and I and our staff, we go over everything legal, everything about domestic violence, trauma, active listening. We train our volunteers more than what they even need to know to respond. They will respond to police departments and hospitals only. So basically, after the 40-hour training, they will give me their schedule or the team leader in the town that they live in, and and then we place them on the team, and they give us their schedule, and the hotline will call. Whenever a police officer calls the hotline, he brings a victim back to the police department. He'll call our hotline and say, I need, say this is Runnymede Police Department, I have a victim here, I need a responder, a DVRT advocate to come out. And then our hotline will call whoever's on the schedule at that time. Our advocate will go out, and our advocate will be there with the victim while the police are doing their paperwork and everything. We're there to listen to the victim. That's where active listening comes in. Let them tell their story. We might be the first person that the victim has ever told the story to. She might not be comfortable to even speak to the police officers and say that. So, and then we explain restraining orders. We give them their options, all the resources that we have, talk about our safe house if they need somewhere to go.
Very important. So there is shelter available as well through your agency and others?
Yes.
Our shelter houses 38 women and children at any given time. That's our capacity. We are the sponsored shelter in Camden County. It's important to note that every county has a safe house. We don't want anybody thinking that there's not a place for them to go or a resource for them to access.
So it's very important if you're facing domestic violence, if you know of someone facing, to make sure they know what the resources are available. Now you mentioned the volunteers, so it's also important to have bilingual volunteers, so we want to pull out a call for volunteers, anyone that's interested. What's the requirement?
You need to be 18 years or older. You need to be able to give us some time, because you'll be on a schedule and you respond to a police station. You need to be able to get to that police station within 20 minutes. You need to be able to spend, say, half an hour to an hour assisting that victim. You have to be available to take the training. We do a criminal background check, and we check some references.
So the other women's centers as well.
Yes.
You could check with them for what the qualifications are and what positions would be available.
On our website, we
Ladies,
have all the information.
thank you so much. A lot of information here to share with us, and very important topics. So thank you.
Thanks.
And thank you. We'll be right back with more Latino Motion.
Latino Motion with Bert Lopez is presented by Latino Motion Public Affairs Media, a New Jersey nonprofit corporation. Join us online at www.latinomotion.tv. Find us on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. We encourage your comments and contributions for show topics.
Welcome back to Latino Motion. When should you consider getting a lawyer, and when should you consider representing yourself? Returning to the show is Caitlin McKinsey with South Jersey Legal Services to discuss these questions and much more. Caitlin, welcome to Latino Motion.
Thank you for having me.
So the last time you were on the show, we talked about South Jersey Legal Services located throughout Southern Jersey. We know that you only represent civil type matters, and we went through a litany of some of the things that you represent, some of the items that would qualify as representation with the agency. Let's talk about some of those ones that we didn't get an opportunity to discuss. Let's start with divorce. You also handle divorce cases?
Yes, we handle certain divorce cases. We only handle uncontested no-fault divorces via one of our projects with pro bono attorneys. So if you have an uncontested no-fault divorce, which would be a divorce with no outstanding property or child issues like child support or child custody, you could contact our intake unit and potentially be set up to meet with a pro bono attorney who works with our program.
So if you did have those type of matters and you have already agreed to terms with your spouse.
Say you already had a child custody order in place, or you don't have children at all, or there is no property, which is sometimes the case for low-income clients or people in general. They just don't have any children. Then you could qualify to come in and meet with a pro bono attorney.
And let's talk about some of the other medical and SSI and SSD type of cases you also handle.
We handle some health law issues, and that would be, for example, if someone has an issue with their Medicaid, or if their Medicaid benefits were terminated, or they were denied certain services under Medicaid. SSI cases and SSD cases can be an entitlement under SSI, or they could be SSD, which is a disability. It's like an insurance you pay into. So we handle joint SSI and SSD cases, which are for people who are experiencing disability. We handle expungements, which are people trying to clear their criminal records, and we also handle domestic violence final restraining orders. We go to trial for those.
I want to talk a little more in depth on that, but before we do, just give him a little more background in terms of the agency, in terms of the cost for this representation. Okay. Tell me a little bit about that.
South Jersey Legal Services provides free legal representation to people. We don't have a sliding scale structure. So long as you qualify based on income up to 250% of the poverty level, and depending on the county, we also represent senior citizens. There isn't an income requirement. For if you're a senior citizen and you're over the age of 60, which is a young senior citizen, you can call our centralized intake unit. So long as it's an issue we handle, we have very flexible income standards, so you can be well above 250% of the federal poverty level and come in and meet with an attorney about your legal issue.
Do you also handle wills? Now you're talking about senior citizens?
Yes, we do. We handle wills and living wills for senior citizens. So if you are looking to get a will or living will, which we recommend that everyone has a will or living will, you can come in and meet with either one of the attorneys in one of the offices or a pro bono attorney about will or living will.
Tell me how you represent clients who are going through domestic violence.
We represent domestic violence victims. So we represent the plaintiff. We do not represent domestic violence defendants. So if you are a plaintiff and you filed a temporary restraining order and you are seeking a final restraining order, we represent victims who are going to trial for final restraining orders. It's actually one of the practice areas that I practice in. And we also have attorneys in the other offices who seek final restraining orders, and we have some volunteer attorneys that work with our program, other pro bono attorneys that seek domestic violence restraining orders at trial. So you would go to trial, you would go in front of a judge just like you would. It's a bench trial for landlord-tenant court, and you offer your evidence and you try to get the final restraining order.
Now, do you also help with preparing the case? In other words, if someone needs to file a restraining order, do you also help file for that initial step, if you will?
We don't, because usually people file temporary restraining orders the day of the incident. Okay. Either they go to the courthouse if it's during normal business hours, or they can file for a restraining order at their municipal police department, which we recommend they do right away. If their restraining order needs to be amended, say they didn't include everything that they might need to include in the restraining order, we could help with the amendment, possibly writing up an amendment or directing them exactly what they should put in the amendment based on what they told us, to make sure that the restraining order is complete as possible, because the judge can only go on what is stated in the four corners of the restraining order.
What would you say? I know that there's a lot of individuals who may be going through domestic violence and often put that temporary restraining order in place and don't follow through. How important is that, to follow through, and perhaps if you feel you're in jeopardy, get that final resolution?
It's extremely important for victims of domestic violence to follow through with their final restraining orders if they feel that they are at potential risk for domestic violence, because it's a way to protect yourself. Final restraining orders are quasi-criminal, which means that if a defendant violates a restraining order, you can call the police and the defendant should be arrested because they are in contempt of the restraining order. So when you do not follow through with the restraining order, you're losing your right to enforce it. You have to, in order to keep it current, you have to go through with the final restraining order. So it's extremely important for victims to protect their rights.
How much of a waiting list? Someone wants to avail themselves of the services. Is there a long waiting period? Do you prioritize cases in terms of issues like domestic violence? I would think that probably higher on the list than a living will. What kind of timeline we're talking about when we're seeking services?
Well, for example, domestic violence cases are emergencies, so they are seen immediately. My cases, and I handle domestic violence cases, if a domestic violence victim comes in, I try to see them as soon as possible that day. For example, landlord-tenant cases, if someone is being evicted and they have a warrant of removal that's set to execute the next day, we would try to get them in as soon as possible. For uncontested no-fault divorces with our pro bono attorneys, with our PAI initiative, so pro bono attorney initiative, sometimes there is a waiting list, but that's a little bit different than someone who's going through an emergency situation. So emergencies are handled immediately, but all of our cases we handle in an expeditious manner as quickly as possible, and we pride ourselves getting people into our office as soon as we possibly can.
You certainly have a wealth of services and very needed in the community. So thank you for sharing this information, and thank you for joining us at home once again here on Latino Motion.
Funding for Latino Motion is provided by Atlanticare, healthcare you can believe in. Atlantic City Electric, energy for a changing world. And South Jersey Gas.